First of all, there's no doubt that we have been far too complacent in the European Union on the protection of fundamental freedoms and for human rights and democracy. We have taken them far too long for granted, and we only started seeing a pushback very, very late in the day. Look at the European Parliament, for example. It took a long time before the European People's Party suspended the governing party of Viktor Orban, despite the fact that he was demonstrating very clear actions, tendencies, actions that undermined the basic principles of the rule of law, which are sacrosanct and are part of the commitments that all member states must adhere to. And of course, speaking of candidate countries, we know how the European People's Party also supported and protected former Prime Minister of North Macedonia, even when he was under investigation for corruption. So the European Parliament is at fault, as is, I'm afraid, the European Commission. The European Parliament, we've had elections earlier this year, and we've seen a growing rise of, again, those populist tendencies. We will see how this will impact on the various policies of the European Union. We've already seen a rather negative impact regarding the climate change and Green Deal. Let's hope that similar negative impacts don't happen with regard to the very critical policy agenda, policy of the European Union, which is the enlargement in the coming years, and making sure that the current negotiations are successful. The European Commission is, we forget sometimes, guardian of the treaties. It has a binding commitment to ensure that all member states fully respect the basic principles of democracy, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. And yet it took quite some time for the Commission to introduce some of the measures that are contained in the basic treaties of the European Union, to take measures against those countries, such as Hungary, to mention one, that were not respecting the basic principles of the rule of law. Because it took them so long to initiate those legal proceedings, of course, we saw Viktor Orban trying to do whatever he could to see how much he could do before the Commission would act. And this is a constant challenge. We saw how during his current mandate as President of the Council, which fortunately is ending at the end of this month, and then we will have a more reasonable, moderate presidency in the hands of Poland that will take the presidency of the Council. But we have seen how in these recent months, Viktor Orban has again tried to undermine, and basically it showed his dismissal of EU institutions. So now we have a new European Commission, and it is absolutely vital that they should catch up on ground lost and do everything possible to make sure that within the European Union there is a full respect, and that if some member states continue to disrespect the rule of law and the basic principles, that it must immediately launch the legal proceedings, because it does have all the instruments at its disposal, not just the Article 7 suspension of voting rights, but also the conditionality attached to financial assistance from the European Union. As we know, in the recent past, there were several large sums of money that were kept back from Hungary because of the fact that they were not respecting the rule of law. So that needs to be used much more effectively and to ensure that the principles are not undermined by these authoritarian tendencies. And of course, it is also the Commission's role to make sure that similar actions are taken with regard to candidate countries. And we, of course, you see there are the annual country reports for each of the candidate countries. I have to say, as Serjan was mentioning Serbia, that I find it quite extraordinary that several EU leaders have been traveling to Belgrade, including the President of the Commission, and praising Mr. President Vucic for progress in the rule of law, when at the same time, if I'm not mistaken, and Serjan, please correct me, the government is detaining more and more representatives of civil society purely because they are criticizing the government or campaigning against this lithium agreement that was signed some time ago. So this is not conducive to making sure that those candidate countries like Serbia will fully respect the principles that they should be respecting as candidate countries. And I think it behoves on the European Commission to make sure that it is not complacent or does not try to gloss over many of the issues concerning the violation of the rule of law happening in countries such as Serbia. And I would also emphasize two other aspects. One is the role of civil society. And we have seen that this is a requirement for all candidate countries because we all know that civil society is a critical element in ensuring accountability of the governments. Of course, if they are put in jail, as is happening in a number of instances in Serbia, it doesn't help. And this should be called out by the European Commission and not accepted as unfortunately it seems to be happening. I'm delighted to see that the new Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Koss, last week at an event I attended in Brussels, she was very clear, and she says that I will do everything possible to ensure that the governments fully respect the critical role of civil society. She also said she will go out to meet with human rights defenders, and this was really a breath of fresh air compared to the dreadful record of her predecessor, who did very little in this respect. So I'm hopeful that the new Commission, with the new Commission for Enlargement, will really turn the page and ensure that there's a far greater attention on all of these aspects with regard to the accession process. And lastly, with regard to independent media, and there we have seen, it was mentioned by Serjan and others, but also in North Macedonia, we have seen instances of where journalists have been attacked, criticized on social media merely because they presented objective views with regard to current events. And many of them have been subject to lawsuits as well as a way of silencing journalists. And here again, we are fortunate that finally the European Union now has, following the adoption of a directive, now has an instrument which will ensure that try to reduce these lawsuits. It's called the so-called SLAP directive on strategic lawsuits against public participation. Of course, legislation is fine, but it's not enough. And what we need to do is to ensure that the mindsets are also changed so that governments accept that it is the role of journalists to be critical of governments and, like civil society, to hold them accountable. So I will conclude there by hoping and relatively optimistic after my discussions last week in Brussels and hearing statements like the one from the new commissioner, I'm hopeful that there will be a change of approach and that there'll be a far more rigorous attention to ensuring that both inside the European Union and with regard to candidate countries, full respect of the principles that are at the foundation of the European project, which we mustn't forget is a peace project. Yes, well, there's lots I could say on North Macedonia, but obviously time. And yes, it is clear that North Macedonia is facing some difficult challenges with regard to its accession process, not least the issue of the ongoing bilateral dispute with Bulgaria. I asked a question on that to the Commissioner last week, and she was very clear. She said that it is the desire and her wish that bilateral disputes do not impede the accession process. And she admitted that the Commission has not been as successful as it would wish in preventing bilateral disputes from undermining the accession process and also undermining the credibility of the European Union. Imposed solutions are not ones which will guarantee long-term reconciliation. Be that as it may, an agreement was presented, and so I think it will be important for the government to continue on this path to try to resolve this problem. But it is quite clear that bilateral disputes must be dealt with separately from the accession process. If they are allowed to impede on the accession process, if we allow history and identity and other such issues to enter into the accession process, then the accession process of the European Union will be a failure. It's absolutely vital that the European Commission sets up a separate mechanism to deal with these bilateral disputes and to find common solutions that will not impede but promote reconciliation in the region. And that's another point that the Commissioner said, which was that part of her initial statement is to promote reconciliation, again admitting that not enough had been done in this respect, and this will now be also one of the important priorities for the European Commission in the region. And with regard to the media, as I mentioned, there have been, and the Commission's report mentions that, the recent progress report on North Macedonia mentions the various number of attacks and that have been perpetrated verbally, but also, I understand, physically, against journalists, and the way social media is being used by government supporters to undermine the credibility of journalists who are just fulfilling their professional duties. And there again, it is important that the government do everything possible to prevent this happening. Accepting criticism should be a normal part of a democracy. And like in Serbia, unfortunately, we see that the governing parties don't seem to want to accept that. So, yes, there's still a lot of work to be done for the North Macedonia in the accession process. The rule of law, corruption is still a terrible problem, as we've seen the latest United States declaration on the blacklist people. And this shows that the government needs to do much, much more on these issues in order to continue on its journey towards the European Union.